Good evening, everybody, and welcome. Welcome to this evening's talk. This evening's talk by Paula Ware on Eastfield and Middle Deepdale, a complex multi-period landscape. We're all familiar with Paula. Paula was very kind to give us a talk a little while ago on the, I think, on Pocklington chariot burials. Just a bit of, before we start, just to remind you, as always, if you've got any questions for Paula, if you can ask them in the chat window, if you're watching on YouTube on a computer, or you can just email them into me on the email address feedback@sars.org.uk. As usual, please feel free to ask the questions during the course of Paula's talk, and then what I'll do is I'll collate those at the end and put them to Paula at the end. So there's a bit of a delay between you receiving this and Paula's talk, so make sure you get your questions in early not to miss out. So I've mentioned it numerous times already, so good evening, Paula.
Good evening, everybody. I know that many of you have been to the site of the excavations, and most of the media attention has been on the Roman buildings, that complex of buildings that we still don't understand, but hopefully I'll be able to enlighten you a little bit more tonight in terms of where we are. But apart from the Roman buildings, it's a fascinating landscape, and I want to talk about that. So I think the Roman buildings sort of are so significant, but I think it's potentially from something that's happening for thousands of years in the landscape. But let's wait and see. So here we are with Eastfield, marked on the map, Scarborough, Filey, Bridlington, all known Roman sites, although Scarborough has limited information for early Roman deposits, but Eastfield, I think, is definitely changing that. And then we have Malton, the fort at Malton, and Stamford Bridge, and Hayton, York, Tadcaster, Brough. So we can see Eastfield here, and I should have really marked Crossgate Seamer on. In 2000, Matt were excavating ahead of housing, and discovered a 2nd century Roman single cell building. We didn't actually excavate it. It was preserved in situ and became a scheduled ancient monument. But that starts to put Eastfield into some kind of context in terms of Roman Yorkshire. Eastfield, as we all know, is a modern post-war housing estate situated close to the Iron Age and Roman settlement, located, as I've said, at Crossgates down here. This is the building, and these are the two areas that we have been allocated and have been granted planning permission, and are under the construction of houses is well underway in both HA2 and HA1. HA2 was where the initial work excavations have been undertaken, and HA1 is where we're presently working. The site has been allocated for housing. It's within Scarborough Civil Parish, and obviously in North Yorkshire. And the overall development is divided between High Eastfield and Middle Deepdale, which are separated by Deepdale and lie immediately north of the existing residential estate of Eastfield and west of Osgoodby Village and south of the new Eastway Link Road. The land has been allocated for housing, and indeed many of the properties are constructed and occupied. The geology. We've had useful insight from members of the society, including Peter Rawson, who I am very grateful for, but the land slopes gradually away from its northern edge at a height of some 75 metres AOD to about 55 metres on the southern boundary. The solid geology within the area is calcareous grit within the northern part of the site, oolitic limestone and sandstone towards the south, with a band of molten oolitic and coral rag along the southern boundary. Just jumped. I'm sorry about this. Just go back. The work was instigated as part of the planning permission, We excavated 111 trenches based on the results of the geophysical survey. The geophysical survey was undertaken by West Yorkshire Archaeological Service, and as you can see here, we can see clearly the extensive activity. We had 111 trenches excavated, which revealed a late Iron Age Romano-British washing line enclosure settlement for both areas. In hindsight, HA1, where the complex of buildings are, we've looked at the position of the trenches, and they sort of seem to miss those buildings quite conveniently. So that's sort of put a different slant on the site. It hasn't been a smooth process in terms of what we were expecting and what we were anticipating. But the initial phase of HA2 was in fact pretty plain sailing, and it was exactly as the geophysical survey had predicted. Outline planning permission for the development was granted by Scarborough Borough Council in September 2012, with numerous reserved matters, including a very extensive archaeological condition, which amounts to over 12 hectares of excavation. We still have further areas that needs to be excavated, but the bulk of the excavation has now been completed or coming to its final stages. See here, this is what we call the Middle Deepdale site here. You can see Filey in the background. I'm not actually saying that you can see the sea from the site. This was taken by a drone up at 35 meters, but you can actually see, and some of the views that we have had are quite spectacular. And then you can see Deepdale here, and this here is HA1, the area of present excavations, and you can see this is the area at the moment that we're actually excavating in this area. So what can we say about the landscape? Well, the Mesolithic period of the site is represented by residual flints and implements, and it must be stressed that there are no contemporary deposits or features yet, is what I'm going to say on that. And the flint appears to span the entire Mesolithic period, ranging from possibly Upper Paleolithic with a shouldered point to a microlith from the Mesolithic early Neolithic transition. So clearly a wide time span of early activity is evidenced at the site. With the Mesolithic type site of Star Car and the associated landscape of Lake Flixton lying circa 2.8 kilometres to the southwest of Eastfield, the Mesolithic flint assemblage does have a wider landscape significance. And I think this is one of the key things that we need to be looking at in terms of describing the landscape when we look at how long the land has been utilised. The earliest recorded archaeological evidence of occupation within the development area dates to the Neolithic period and was identified during the trial trenching. The archaeological features included small pits, post holes and gullies, and were restricted to the southeastern corner of HA1. A particular pit contained 99 worked flints and carbonised hazelnuts, providing an absolute date of 3340 to 3020 BC. Another contained a significant assemblage of 102 sherds of Durrington Wall style pottery of the late Neolithic grooveware tradition, alongside the carbonised hazelnuts, providing a radiocarbon date of 2620 to 2450 BC. Excavation in HA2 has added further evidence with more features dating to the Neolithic, indicating the land was being used for hunting. The importance of the finds recovered and associated environmental evidence provides not only absolute dating, but highlights the importance of Neolithic occupation on the site, which is of regional, if not national significance. Whilst there is evidence in the form of round barrows surrounding the site, to date, there's no excavated evidence to support activity for this period, but this may change once the post-excavation stage is well established. the Middle Iron Age. We have 3 barrows at HA2 belonging to Halkins Group 1 as relatively large barrows with no surviving primary graves. Although by no means tightly clustered, the 3 barrows were all in the southeastern area of HA2, with Barrow 2 and Barrow 3 outside the areas that were later enclosed, and Barrow 1 assimilated into a later enclosure, situated downhill from the others. It's possible that the barrows represent dispersed Iron Age funerary zone centred on the ridge of the southern side of the site. And once again, we're seeing these barrows in other sites in the area. And I have hinted before that possibly we're looking at some kind of boundary markers for these. We've been undertaking some work at Caton, and the geophysics looks as though there are isolated square barrows there, but unfortunately the trial trenching hasn't confirmed that. But I think it is worth looking in terms of where these square barrows are associated and how they interplay with the landscape. And here, these are the excavation, just to show you what we've been doing at HA2 and the complexity and the nature of the expansion of the enclosures on both sides. The cursor, sorry, is just, there we go. I've got the cursor here. This was the first area of excavation undertaken in 2014. And this is exactly represented by the geophysical survey, but you can see the complexity of sites, and I'm going to talk about it and the phasing in detail, but you can see the enclosures that added onto the droveway that comes through. We have roundhouses and gullies that are established in the Iron Age and continue right the way through to the late 4th century. So when we were excavating this, it was exactly as we thought we were going to see over the whole of the site. And this was the next phase of excavation, once again, exactly like the geophysics had anticipated. Here, the square barrow here, another square barrow that's attached to the enclosure, and another barrow here. These are the 3 Iron Age barrows. And then we have the enclosures and this area of activity up here, which I'll be discussing later. But you can see it was described as an average Iron Age rural site. So the Middle Iron Age, the 3 barrows at HA2 belong to Halkins, as I've said. You can see here the square barrow with the internal grave. Cursor, sorry. Internal grave here, and the crouched inhumation. And contemporary with the barrows were the remains of 2 early trackways, including some surfacing remains, an early northwest to southeast boundary ditch, which later became the northern boundary of the enclosure complex, as well as a number of roundhouses or ring gullies. Excavated evidence suggests that part of the trackway consisted of 3 elements of construction, which were better preserved at the northern end of the site. The latest phase of construction consisted of large cobbles representing infill repair, perhaps a response to ruts caused by cartwheels. The northern boundary element of the site was incorporated into the later enclosure complex, illustrated by the later ditch segments which intersected it. A lack of early material evidence within the fills suggested the boundary ditch was continually reinstated throughout the history of the site. The establishment of landscape features which later enclosures hung from. And these trackways, at the time when we were excavating this side, we just assumed that these trackways were to take entrances into enclosures, but actually now looking at them, they once again, these landscape features all seem to be heading up to Deepdale and across. And then when we come into HA1, these trackways heading up towards Oliver's Mount. The roundhouses were established in this phase, with the material evidence suggesting that the ring gullies served as drip gullies and were regularly maintained and cleaned out. Some of these later phases were, you can see that they were backfilled and then replaced by later stone structures, which is something else that we need to sort of now be considering in light of what we have on HA1. And some of the other smaller partial ring gullies perhaps represented hay racks or fodder pens rather than roundhouses. It's clear that the Iron Age landscape boundaries act as the spines upon which the first group of enclosures were laid over to create the enclosure complex. This seems to occur around the same time as the Roman conquest, judging by the material recovered from within the ditch fills. And initially, when we were on HA1, we were so surprised at the lack of finds in comparison to what we'd had at HA2, but now that has started to swing around, that we have. Okay, that's fine.
Hello, buddy. Sorry about that. I think we had a bit of an internet connection issue there. So I've asked Paula just to go back to where I think we lost the connection from. Hopefully we can pick up from there. So many apologies for that.
I'm sorry if I'm going to repeat myself, and you've heard it, but the roundhouses were established in this phase with the material evidence suggesting that the ring gullies served as drip gullies and were regularly maintained and cleaned out. Once again, lack of artifacts recovered from within the roundhouse fill suggests that they remained in use until the later phases of the enclosure and were only backfilled when they were replaced by later stone structures. Some of the other smaller partial ring gullies perhaps represented hay racks or fodder pens rather than roundhouses. It's clear that the Iron Age landscape boundaries acted as spines upon which the first group of enclosures were laid over to create the enclosure complex. This seems to occur around the same time as the Roman conquest, judging by the material recovered within the ditch fills. Initially, only 2 enclosures were completely enclosed during this early period. The highlighted area, which once again I'm hoping, this area up here, reveals an area of intensive industrial activity, including hearths, corn dryers and pits. Like most late Iron Age RB settlements, indications of metalworking have been found, but we actually have quite high proportions of slag and have been found in numerous pits. But the main area of industrial activity is still to be excavated. It was hinted at during the trial trenches, and we hope to be excavating this area possibly in 2022, but it'll be up to the developer in HA2 as and when they need that phase. But there is another exciting area of excavation, and it will be really useful in terms of industrial activity to see if there's any link to the Roman buildings in HA1. And so the Roman period was concerned with the rapidly ensuing modification of the late Iron Age enclosure compartments, which created later boundaries and compartments and subdivisions, or replacements of the original boundaries with wider ditches. And the recovered environmental data predominantly suggests that the majority of boundary ditches were regularly maintained, cleaned out with only trace remains recovered, suggesting they were not allowed to silt up but recut in response to activity within the enclosures. It's also within this period that a degree of Romanization can be seen, with pottery of a more Roman character deposited at the site from the late 2nd into the mid-3rd century. Another hint at Romanization in this period is the occurrence of bread wheat. Although it's in small quantities, it hints that there is possibly a military connection, or, and this is the exact wording from the assessment report, that it could have been there for feasting purposes. Now, when we think about that link back to those buildings that in HA1 and what we're suggesting there, that possibly we're seeing more links to identify a possible function for those buildings. The apparent flourishing in activity on site during the mid to late 4th century is characterised by the establishment of a number of structures represented by either sunken floor buildings or hollows, which appear to have been positioned to almost certainly take advantage to some extent of the enclosures on site. Although the structures are poorly preserved and severely robbed, they no doubt represent either sunken floor buildings or unroofed hollows because they were characteristically similar to others identified elsewhere. The buildings were single-storey structures, sub-square in plan, and probably built with stone walls, with some tentative evidence of central post holes to support the roof and cobble floors. The environmental material derived from the building in HA2 consisted of large concentrations of cereal grain and thick heather roots, presumably peat for heating the buildings. By the late 4th century, the enclosures were being modified with the addition of a large subcircular or D-shaped enclosure being superimposed onto the southern boundary of an earlier enclosure. Along with the establishment of a droveway and the formation of the last enclosure compartment, this was perhaps a response to the increased agricultural activity taking place within the interior of the enclosures. Both the location, its entrance mirroring a droveway, and the lack of internal features within the D-shaped enclosure suggested it was utilised to hold stock, which could be efficiently moved in or out of the enclosure via the droveway. Little information can be discerned about the animal species that may have been kept within the enclosures because of the adverse soil conditions and the fragmentary nature of animal bone survival across the excavation. The environmental material does indicate a mixed arable agricultural farming settlement complex by the findings of spelt wheat and hulled barley crops, together with corn, marigold, and some rare carbonised seaweed middened as fertilisers on fields. HA1. HA1 excavations commenced in 2019. Actually, 2018, we did the initial excavation for the compound for the development, but the large-scale excavations commenced in 2019. Unfortunately, COVID hit. Whilst we were about 5 months into the excavation, but you can just see here the extent of the site that we had to excavate. I love this drone image because you can see the sea in the background, Oliver's Mount, and Scarborough Castle as well in the background. So the two key elements of the site are firstly the prominent landscape position, which would have been an important feature dominating the eastern end of the Vale of Pickering. This was a site that commanded the surrounding area and would have been noticeable to anyone passing through the landscape. The second feature that needs to be considered is the role of water. The many ditches and water features and the failure of some could be the reason for the demise of the site. Start of the excavation. We'd always had a chuckle to ourselves that possibly, we'd get some nice Roman buildings. We'd had footings during the trial trenching. In our wildest dreams, we never imagined that we would get these buildings. You can see this is the start of the perimeter wall that was revealed. We have a pit, stone line pit here. You can see the curve here of the one of the main circular building that everybody recognises now. More footings here, post pad here, and this lovely post pad that's in building 6. It was soon apparent that the site was considerably more significant than originally expected. The site has had numerous issues to overcome, including COVID, which meant no excavation took place for nearly 6 months, and had the team excavating for back-to-back miserable winters, and it's a credit to the team. In early May, a statement was released to the media, and the full force of attention was focused on the site. From press, TV and radio, such was the excitement of the discovery. The later phase core buildings have such a visual impact, not only due to the preservation, but the unusual architectural style. This is the current plan with some of the key buildings numbered. The assessment is currently work in progress, so much of the narrative is from observations in the field and the numerous discussions with various experts, including Pete Wilston, Rick Powsland, Martin Millett, and in turn, helpful suggestions and advice from leading academics and members of the society. Anything suggested tonight may in turn be disregarded once specialists have seen the fine assemblages, which they are actually now starting to receive. Work continues on the phasing of the buildings led by Al Cross and Martin Thomas, but this plan reveals the complexity to unravelling the building phases. The earliest recognised features were the numerous ditches that formed enclosures and divisions across the site, very, very similar to HA2. The trackway, which will be discussed later, is probably established during this period. Several structures resembling roundhouses are assigned to this period, including structure A. This is structure A, measuring 8 meters in diameter and constructed using stone footings. No entrance was clear, although the west side has been lost to later truncation. Internally, a number of burnt features, a stone-lined pit and a possible hearth were excavated. It post-dated an east-west stitch. Structure B, up here, was evenly more heavily truncated and comprised of 2 short lengths of curving stone wall footings overlain by later building 14. North of these were 2 fragments of highly truncated ring gully. It was unclear due to truncation whether these were the remains of roundhouses, small enclosures or windbreaks. Further to the north, 2 further very truncated features may also be remnants of roundhouses. One structure appeared to form a roundhouse, was 7.5 meters in diameter with stone footings forming its outer wall. It was more heavily truncated than the previous structure at near building 14, as the only surviving internal feature being a possible central post pad and deposit. West of these, a slight hollow appeared to have been subject to occupation, although whether this was the form of a roundhouse was unclear. The structure appeared to have 2 phases of use. The first phase comprised a number of post holes, often with stone packing, and a short curvilinear gully. These were overlain by deposits, remodelling the area, and a series of stone post pads forming a slabbed area. These were themselves covered by a charcoal-rich deposit. Close to these structures, 2 crouched adult skeletons were located. And south of these, a very large pit was excavated. It was ovoid and measured 6 by 4 and 2 meters in depth. And many of you may remember when we were when you came to visit site, it's that, was it a water cistern? But there's no, its purpose is still unclear. There was no apparent silting in the base. However, it's possible it was used as a cistern for holding water. Although described here as a single phase, it's unclear if these buildings ever existed together at a single time. But these are the earliest buildings that we have for this area. And their dispersed nature means that there's little in the way of a definite stratigraphic relationship between them, and between them or the fragments of the boundary wall. And their treatment together is based upon the coherence of the site layout and similarities in construction. Likewise, by the end of their use in the late Iron Age, we're not sure, we don't really know what happens with them. It's unclear. We don't have the evidence to be able to say to you that they didn't exist into the Roman period. Buildings away from these central structures may well have continued in use during the Roman period. At some point, possibly in the 1st century AD, almost all the ditches were put out of use and was at least part of the trackway. A widespread deposit covered ditches and is interpreted as intentional deposition, in order to remodel the landscape in this area in preparation for building the early Roman buildings. One area where stratigraphic relations reveal the sequence of the structures, seemingly the earliest masonry structure here, was a single square room 21. So this went on to become the centre to the north to south rectangular building. It was sited over 2 Iron Age ditches, at a point where at least one phase of ditching had an entranceway. Only a limited amount of this first structure was investigated due to the later building imposed above it. It measured 4 metres north to south and 5 metres east to west, and was heated by a hypocaust with the furnace sited in the north wall of the building. The room appeared to have been modified, with the north wall being rebuilt less than a metre further south, possibly due to issues of subsidence. It was unclear if this resulted in the hypocaust going out of use. Possibly contemporary with these changes, the southern wall was removed and the building extended 9 metres southwards to form the start of the rectangular range. Room 19 was modified modified with a structure forming another room. This measured 5 metres square and contained a sunken floor with a possible furnace vent in the west wall. These features, combined with numerous box flue tile fragments in the rubble filling up the space, suggest that the room was intended to be heated, although no evidence of pili was uncovered. North of this room, sizable cobble footings butted the rebuilt northern wall and continued the line of the rectangular range a further 13 metres. This must have marked the end of the room. What form the construction on top of these footings took was unclear. Due to the terraced nature of the slope in this area, these rooms were offered more protection from later truncation, and any structures sat on those cobble footings would have been more exposed. A single course of stonework, along with a work stone threshold, showed the outline of a room in this area. However, this room did not fill the cobble footing from east to west. It also sat 3 metres from the north end of the footings, perhaps suggesting it represented a later reuse of the area. A further extension south comprised of 3 smaller rooms arranged east to west, forming a southern wing on the rectangular range. These appear to represent a small bath suite with a possible unused Prehistoric in the west and 2 sunken rooms, which again lacked the expected evidence of heating and hypocaust pillars. The larger of these 2 rooms, 17, contained a distinctive rubble deposit of worked tufa blocks, possibly suggesting a complex arched or vaulted ceiling. At the east end of this area, a small masonry feature was identified as a probable coal plunge pool, possibly incomplete. This was attached to a truncated wall footing that suggested an unknown eastern limit to the buildings. See the buildings. Rooms 16 to 18. The heated range appears to have been intended as a bath suite. And the main room, the hot room, the caldarium to the east, room 17. A further room is located east of room 17, but is overlain by later construction. The heated range may incorporate a possible plunge bath on its southern side. And the reason why I smiled is I'm going to put a photo in shortly to show you how some people really enjoyed a visit to site. It appears that the bath suite remained incomplete. The large amount of collapsed tufa, source of which is presently being investigated, further hints at the sophistication in the construction of these rooms, and possibly hints that tufa has been reused from a previous building. The evidence suggests that these rooms were either domed or barrel vaulted. Several pieces of the tufa have surviving remnants of a fine coat of wall plaster. Yet again, one of the many issues with analysing the site is the removal of so much of the demolition material, and yet key components are left, such as the roofing material that provides a function for the building. Are we looking at the deliberate demolition of the building from the visual landscape in the late 4th century, but with certain key elements retained in recognition of the site's form and function, But equally, the evidence suggests that some of the buildings never functioned or were completed, with no evidence of firing in the bath suite. The site is incredibly frustrating, and with so many contradictions, makes interpretation so difficult. You can see the series of terraces cuts into the slope to carry the main buildings. And as you know, it was decided that these buildings would be preserved in situ. So interpreting earlier phases without excavating is also one of the frustrating features. And possibly we'll never have the evidence to be able to actually say what was going on in these buildings. The core of the building complex is formed by a near circular structure, room 1. It's 8 meters in diameter, internal diameter, which is another interesting feature when we think back to the earlier stone-built roundhouses, between 7.5 and 8 meters in diameter. And they were entered from the east through what might be termed a porch, which has roughly square rooms attached to its northern, western and southern sides, rooms 2 to 4. Room 3 incorporates an unfired hypercourse that includes elements of the hypercourse from the preceding phase. Rooms 2 and 4 both have opus signum floors and are both of 2 phases. However, despite the longevity implied by these rooms being remodelled, it's clear that this is possibly unique structure is a relative late insertion into the building complex. And this is demonstrated by room 4, which can be seen to overlie part of the Western Range aligned north-south. And this gives you more detail in terms of the buildings and the complexity and the phasing. And yes, I think that we will always have that feeling of what if, but maybe somebody will excavate it in later years. And the threshold entrance into that circular building is internally dressed in that really white, distinctive limestone, and would have had such a visual impact on any visitor to the complex. And this, you can see the pili here. Another interesting feature in terms of the pili, you know, we would normally associate it with tiles. It's pretty rough, and it incorporates reused tufa, presumably from the earlier phases. And the slab floor had been inserted after the pili had been opened to the elements and then sealed, because the soil deposits were quite clear between the stacks. And these rooms had been appended to the circular room 1. The northern perimeter is suggested to follow the line of the intermittent walling, as you can see up here. And building 14 is situated north of the complex. The function of the building, like much of the site, is open to interpretation. Hopefully, dating material will provide the necessary evidence to place the building in its correct sequence. What's certain is that the building consisted of numerous phases and remodelling, but whether it was the original focus of activity is not certain. It was rectangular in shape and measured 20 metres north to south and 8.5 east to west. It started as an entirely post-built structure before stone and clay wall footings replaced the outermost post holes. Internal post holes probably continued in use. A single internal wall footing survived, suggesting that 4 metres at the north of the building was divided off. Although other timber partitions may have left little evidence, within this division is a large vertically sided flat bottom pit, which was central to this area. Although its purpose is unclear, both the north and south end walls appear to have collapsed and survived by subsiding into these lower features. You can see this is building 14 and provides an exception in terms of preservation at its northern and southern gable walls. And they were probably deliberately pushed into the building, with the inner faces surviving as they fell. You can see decoration here that survives the wall. Northeast of the main building, another rectangular building shared its north-south alignment. This building measured 8 metres north to south and 6 metres wide, and was unusually constructed almost entirely from limestone blocks, The original construction had 2 internal walls added, dividing off narrow spaces at the north and south ends, and internally several beam slots and post holes were excavated, along with a considerable collapse of dump of painted wall plaster. This, along with the quality of the masonry, suggests a high status use of the building, whilst the west, south and north walls of this building survived to a height of 3 stone courses, nearly 40 centimetres in place. Buildings 6 and 7 to the south of the Eastfield were a pair of large, roughly north-south aligned aisled buildings. And building 6 incorporates 4 substantial socket stones for posts and a number of features with evidence of burning hearths, or more likely bread ovens. Once again, going back to this theory in terms of feasting, were these just seasonal bread ovens used for a particular function? Hopefully, we will get the evidence. Whilst numerous visitors to the site commented on the likelihood of the socket stones being similar to ones found in signal station, this idea can be dismissed. It is more likely that they represent another aisled building. The evidence, like so many of the buildings, was that they were not permanently occupied. The trackway approaches the compound from the south, and the wheel ruts were evident in the later visible phase. However, the trackway predates the buildings and meanders through the compound and into later phases. This trackway had existed from at least the Iron Age. Against the eastern boundary wall, there is an extremely long building aligned north-south that in its final form was aisled and butted the eastern boundary wall, but was initially a freestanding structure. It was 35 metres long and 30 metres wide. Hopefully, at the post-excavation stage, evidence may be secured to ascertain whether the building was multi-roomed or portioned, or could have been open internally. A major issue is going to be establishing the function of these individual buildings. Building 9 South is located in the southeast corner of the compound. See the building here. And these are the various elements that we can see on site that make up the deposits. These are the circular structures, stone structures, the earlier structures, lovely pair of tongs that were found in structure A, another circular structure here, and you can see an earlier structure coming through here. And that's a pit with a quern. Throughout the excavation, certain features included in the well sparked much debate. Could this be the feature that held the evidence to determine the function of the site? Excavated into the limestone to a depth of circa 9 metres, with a beautiful carved ledge to enable access. Unfortunately, despite everybody's best will, the well never functioned. Although initially James Rackham didn't think we were going to get very much in the way in terms of environmental evidence, it now appears that we will be able to give an update, and we've just sent some samples of C14 from the lower deposits, which will be really useful. At about 4 metres, we had a collection of deer antler, which have also gone for C14 dating. Numerous archaeological techniques were adopted from conventional dig and record, and until not even stepping the sides for safe working could achieve full excavation. The interior of the well has been recorded by drone, and eventually James Rackham was called upon with his piling rig, but was only to give us the disappointing news that the well had never functioned due to the band of carboniferous gritstone that was impossible to break through. Thwarted yet again. Dating evidence, as I said, may shed light on the well, but then I am ever the optimist. These are part of the quern that we've retrieved from site that have been incorporated presumably into working surfaces. Some really nice querns that have come out. These are bread ovens in more detail from building 6. And we've had evidence of kilns inserted in this earlier ditch. And after use, the kiln survived with the insertion of a stone revetment to obviously maintain the ditch. Yet another puzzling feature, and whilst no environmental residues survive, the similarity in form to a pottery kiln located in Norton Malton is worth noting, and the very early date that was on that of late first century. There is little evidence of demolition material. One particular fragment of architectural fragment points at the potential status of the buildings with the finial from a roof. And that's just to give you the interpretation of the compound with building 14 to the north. And here's some of the exciting finds from painted cranbeck ware, beautiful glass bangles, coins, painted wall plaster, bone pins, knives, and a Iron Age bone comb. And it's so easy to focus on the Roman building complex, but I'd like to stress the significance of the site and the importance of putting the site within its place in the landscape. The two following finds, a Neolithic greenstone axe and a pre-conquest Dressel 2-4 amphora, hint at the long-standing presence of a site. And are we looking at and since we really should not be concentrating on the later phases. So what do we think the site represents? Well, latest thoughts tend to suggest a seasonal site for veneration with feasting. In the coming months, the narrative may become clearer. And back to where we are presently on site. We're working in this enclosure here. You can see that's been 100% excavated. But within this whole area, we have a collection of Neolithic pits. Another axe has come out, and these fantastic flints. Looking forward to reading the flint report shortly. And this is the largest metal object. It's been at the labs. I'm fascinated to hear what Hilary Coole's got to say about that. And one of the highlights for me in terms of being involved with Eastfield was a visit by some of the school children from Scarborough. They were amazing, and they really put me on the spot with some of their questions. And as you can see, they did find a use, very appropriate use for the plunge pool in building the bathhouse suite. And many thanks to all at MAP, especially Alistair Cross and Martin Thomas and everybody else, Keith Emmerich and Andy Hammond from Historic England, Peter Rowe, and finally Keep Moat Homes, who have funded it. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Paula. That was amazing. I mean, how you managed to get all that into the length of time you had available to you, I'm intrigued, amazed. So thank you for that. If I can just go back, if I may, to Alison sent a question in just right almost at the very start, just asking what the washing line was. What is the washing line? I think it was on the geology right at the start.
That's an archaeological term where you have one single line, the washing line, and then you hang the enclosures off it. So that's why we use that term.
Right. Okay. That's good. Yes. We're clear on that. That's great. I was intrigued. You said that the well was never used. Is that right? Did you say that, or never functioned?
Yes.
So does that imply that they constructed the fabulous top around the things and then sort of drove down to sort of the things? So
yes, that's right.
So there's a huge investment in time and effort there.
Huge investment in time.
That's right. And it was
so sad.
That's it. And then of the building with the rotunda, what always intrigued me was that it's on a very slightly different alignment. Is it only 10 or so degrees from the things?
You're right.
Is that very atypical?
It is very atypical. Yeah. The whole site is.
I know we could sit here for the next hour. I think just sort of further things. So, well, is that different to anything that you found on there? But I mean, just sort of, but it almost seemed as though there was walls joining that building to the existing one, even though it was at that slightly different alignment. Is that?
You're right. Yes. Yeah. That's correct.
I'm intrigued. When does the book come out? I mean, I think it would just be pictures, and you just left to everybody's interpretation. Is it?
I think historic Historic England have kindly said that you know, they'll take it through to publication. I mean, just because of the significance, but it isn't just those Roman buildings. That's what I really want to stress, is that we're looking at such a complex landscape.
I mean, the Neolithic finds as well. I mean, that's really intriguing, isn't it? On there, and
It is.
was there any finds within the square barrow that you found at all? Obviously, you did in inhumation. Were there any finds associated with that at all?
No, I think there may be one flint, but no ceramics, nothing like that. But some of the Neolithic pits that we're excavating at the minute, they do have more Neolithic pottery.
Right.
There's more grooved ware. Yeah.
And what are the plans for the site as they stand at the moment then? So obviously you're still on site excavating as I say then now, and then sort of like the current Roman remains, are they covered now and sort of in state of ready for preservation, or?
That still needs to be undertaken. They were waiting for the roads to go in, but obviously because of the weather, which now is improving, the roads will be blacked. And my understanding is there will be an opportunity for people to come and visit the site, and then it will be backfilled by the archaeologists. Not, yeah.
I know how much all you archaeologists love backfilling as well. So
I know. Could be a hard day, that one.
Well, thank you so much for that, Paula. That's great, and I think you've probably sort of posed more questions for everybody to think about, and then things and say. And as I say, it's important to, like say, to realise that this is not just a focus on the Romans, but obviously the huge period of time that this occupied, isn't it, on that particular site? And as I say, you're finding most as you move towards Oliver's Mount, you're sort of like, is that you're getting?
Yeah, I'm tend to agree with Pete Wills, and I think Oliver's Mount could actually be the key to understanding. As I say, I'm an optimist. We're going to find it. We're going to find it. The reason. I think there's more. The geophysic hints that there's definitely extensive archaeology heading up towards Oliver's Mount.
Up towards that thing. So, well, there we go. I think that's an intriguing point to leave it on that. So, thank you once again. It's been an absolute pleasure listening to you this evening. So, thank you very much.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you, everybody. And so I do apologise once again for the interruption in the middle there, but I think hopefully that didn't inspire enjoyment too much. 2 weeks' time, we've got the AGM, not using the most exciting things, but we do have a good number of speakers giving us updates on the activities the society has undertaken through the year. So hopefully you can join us then. Thanks for joining us.